The black woman thought he hired her to cook, until his daughter whispered through the kitchen doorway, "I picked you to be my mommy." The frontier town branded her a thief, their whispers following the accused woman like vultures circling wounded prey. They expected her to vanish into obscurity, another casualty of false accusations and frontier justice. But the stoic rancher needed someone to tend his motherless child, a melancholy girl whose loneliness had driven her to desperate measures. What he didn't know was that his daughter had orchestrated this entire meeting, forging letters and weaving lies to bring them together. Now 3 lives hang in the balance, a woman seeking redemption, a man guarding his heart, and a child whose scheme could either heal a broken family or shatter what little remains of their fractured world. Will this deception destroy them all, or create the family each desperately needs? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Clearwater, Colorado territory, dust swirling around its wheels like whispered secrets. Margaret Sable stepped down, clutching a worn employment letter, her dark skin drawing stares from every direction. The year 1883 had not been kind to women of her color, especially those carrying the weight of false accusations. Townspeople paused their conversations to watch her pass, their eyes held judgment sharper than winter wind. Margaret kept her chin high, her steps measured and dignified, despite the whispers trailing behind her like smoke. The general store owner turned his back when she approached for directions. A woman pulled her child closer as Margaret walked by. These reactions no longer surprised her. Denver had taught her what people assumed about a black woman accused of theft, even when the accusations were lies. The Barrett Ranch sat 3 miles outside town, sprawling across golden grassland like a promise of sanctuary. Margaret approached the main house, noting the well-maintained fences and healthy livestock. This was fingers along the wooden counter, noting the quality of the cookware and the size of the larder. This family ate well, or at least had the means to. Movement caught her eye. A small figure darted behind the doorframe, quick as a startled rabbit. Margaret glimpsed golden hair and curious eyes before the child disappeared again. The man showed her to a small room off the kitchen. Clean bedding, a wash basin, and a window overlooking the vegetable garden. More comfort than she had expected, given the circumstances that had brought her here. He explained her duties with military precision. Cook 3 meals daily. Keep the kitchen and dining areas clean. Laundry twice weekly. Stay out of the family quarters. No visitors. No questions about personal matters. Margaret nodded at each instruction. She had learned to navigate such arrangements. Keep her head down, do her work, earn her keep. Survival had taught her these lessons well. Supper preparation revealed the true nature of this household. She found ingredients for a family of 3, but signs that only 2 people had been eating. The little girl from earlier appeared in the doorway several times, watching Margaret work with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. When Margaret rang the dinner bell, father and daughter appeared with the enthusiasm of prisoners reporting for punishment. They took seats at opposite ends of a table built for 8, leaving vast spaces between them that felt wider than the prairie itself. Margaret served pot roast with vegetables, fresh bread, and apple pie. The meal was met with silence so complete she could hear the clock ticking in the parlor. Father and daughter ate mechanically, rarely looking up, never speaking. The child was perhaps 7 years old, with her mother's delicate features and her father's serious eyes. Her dress was clean and well made, her hair properly braided, but something vital was missing. Joy, perhaps, or simply the natural exuberance of childhood. Stranger into their home under false pretenses. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. No legitimate employment. No real invitation, just a child's elaborate scheme to fill the void left by her mother's absence. The little girl's eyes filled with tears as she explained her reasoning. Her father was too sad to think about finding her a mother. She had taken matters into her own hands, choosing Margaret based on nothing more than observed kindness and desperate hope. Margaret looked from father to daughter, understanding the impossible position she now occupied. She could leave immediately, walking away from this deception and these broken people. Or she could stay, becoming complicit in a child's heartbreaking attempt to rebuild her shattered world. The choice would determine the fate of 3 lives hanging in the balance between truth and hope. Margaret chose to stay. The decision surprised even her, but Clara's tears had cracked something inside her chest that had been frozen since Denver. She agreed to remain temporarily until proper arrangements could be made. Eli Barrett accepted this solution with visible relief. His anger faded into embarrassment as he realized his daughter's scheme had succeeded despite its deception. Clara wiped her eyes and smiled for the first time since Margaret's arrival. The following morning established their awkward new routine. Margaret prepared breakfast while Clara hovered nearby, chattering about everything and nothing. Eli ate in silence, stealing glances at both females as if trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Town visits became exercises in endurance. The general store owner served Margaret, but made his displeasure known through dramatic sighs and deliberate slowness. Other customers stepped away when she approached, creating invisible barriers that spoke louder than words. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house whispered loudly enough for Margaret to hear. The thief woman was living at the Barrett place now. Poor little Clara, exposed to such influences. What was Eli thinking, bringing that woman around his innocent child? Margaret bought her supply of distant countries while Margaret explained their customs and climates. He stood in the doorway longer than necessary, listening to Margaret's clear explanations and watching his daughter's animated responses. Small changes began appearing around the house. A loose floorboard was suddenly repaired. Margaret's broken chair disappeared overnight, replaced by a sturdier model. Fresh coffee appeared on the kitchen counter each morning before she began cooking. These gestures went unacknowledged by both parties, but their significance was not lost on Margaret. Eli was showing respect in the only way he knew how. Clara's manipulation continued with the subtlety of a charging bull. She developed mysterious needs that required both adults to address them simultaneously. Books needed retrieving from high shelves while Margaret held the ladder. Garden vegetables required picking while Margaret prepared dinner, necessitating Eli's assistance with the cooking. Through these orchestrated encounters, Margaret glimpsed the man beneath Eli's cold exterior. He spoke softly to his daughter, revealing a tenderness he kept carefully hidden. His hands were gentle when he helped with household tasks, and his rare smiles transformed his entire face. The house began reflecting Margaret's presence in subtle ways. Meals became more elaborate and flavorful. Fresh flowers appeared on the dining table. Windows stayed open during pleasant weather, filling rooms with prairie air and birdsong. Clara blossomed under this attention, like a flower finding sunlight. Her quiet demeanor gave way to genuine laughter, and she began displaying the natural exuberance of childhood that had been suppressed by grief and loneliness. Margaret learned about Elena Barrett through Clara's stories and the family photographs displayed throughout the house. Elena had been educated, cultured, and deeply loved. Her death from pneumonia 2 years earlier had devastated both husband and daughter, leaving them adrift in their own home. The town's hostility escalated during subsequent visits. The blacksmith refused to repair a broken kitchen tool when he learned it belonged to their home. The words were simple but carried weight that made Margaret's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. They stood in comfortable silence, the kitchen warm around them like an embrace. Clara's voice broke the moment, calling for help with her bedtime story. Margaret excused herself, leaving Eli alone with his thoughts and the lingering scent of her lavender soap. Later that night, Margaret sat by her window, looking out at the star-filled sky. The ranch felt different now, less like a place of employment and more like something she had never dared hope for. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Change was coming, whether she wanted it or not. The question was whether she had the courage to embrace it when it arrived. The fever came with the first cold snap of autumn. It swept through Clearwater like wildfire, claiming children and elderly residents with ruthless efficiency. Margaret heard about it during her weekly trip to town, watching worried mothers hurry their children along the dusty streets. Clara developed symptoms 3 days later. She woke with flushed cheeks and glassy eyes, complaining of a headache that made her wince at normal sounds. Margaret felt the child's forehead and knew immediately they were facing something serious. Eli paced the kitchen like a caged animal, while Margaret prepared cool compresses and herbal teas. His fear was palpable, radiating from him in waves that filled the room with tension. He had already lost his wife. The possibility of losing Clara was breaking him before Margaret's eyes. Margaret took charge with quiet authority. She had learned nursing skills during her time in Denver, helping Dr. Morrison treat patients in the poorest sections of the city. Those experiences had taught her to recognize dangerous fevers and the methods needed to break them. She moved Clara to the parlor, where she could monitor her constantly. The child's temperature soared, causing delirium that made her call for her deceased mother and ramble about imagined efforts while Eli's strength supported them both. Neither spoke about the possibility of failure, but it hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Dawn brought the miracle they had prayed for. Clara's fever broke suddenly, leaving her drenched in sweat, but breathing normally for the first time in days. Her eyes opened with clarity instead of delirium, and she smiled weakly at the 2 exhausted adults hovering over her. Her first coherent words were directed at Margaret. She called her Mama, in a voice barely above a whisper, but the impact was thunderous. Margaret's careful emotional barriers crumbled completely, tears streaming down her face as she embraced the child she had fought so hard to save. Eli witnessed this moment with something approaching awe. He watched Margaret cradle his daughter with fierce protectiveness, understanding finally that her love for Clara was absolute and genuine. The realization hit him like a physical blow, reshaping everything he thought he knew about their arrangement. Recovery was slow, but steady. Margaret continued her careful nursing while Clara regained strength day by day. The child's appetite returned gradually, and her natural cheerfulness began reasserting itself in small but encouraging ways. During one of these quiet recovery afternoons, Margaret found herself alone with Eli in the kitchen. Clara was napping peacefully, and the house felt calm for the first time in weeks. They moved around each other with newfound ease, preparing tea and simple food without need for conversation. The silence between them had changed. Where once it held awkwardness and uncertainty, now it carried warmth and understanding. They had been through crisis together and emerged as something approaching partners. Eli broke the quiet with words that had been building inside him for days. He thanked her not just for saving Clara's life, but for bringing love back into their home. His voice carried emotion he rarely allowed himself to express, and his eyes held depths Margaret had never seen before. She responded with equal honesty. Liv's Eli had discovered that his heart could love again, deeper and differently than before, but no less powerfully. The knowledge terrified Margaret more than Clara's fever had. She belonged here in ways that felt both wonderful and dangerous. This family had healed her wounded spirit, but she remained an outsider in the eyes of everyone beyond these walls. Doubt crept in during the following days as Clara continued recovering. Margaret began questioning her right to claim a place that wasn't officially hers. She was still the woman accused of theft, still the outsider who had arrived under false pretenses. The decision formed gradually, but inexorably. She would leave before she caused more problems for this family she had come to love. It was the kindest thing she could do for them all. Margaret wrote the letter by lamplight, while the house slept around her. Each word felt like a small betrayal, but she forced herself to continue. Clara deserved a mother who could walk freely in town without bringing shame. Eli needed a wife the community would accept without reservation. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the kitchen table, where Clara would find it in the morning. Her packed carpet bag sat by the door, ready for the early stage to Denver. In the city, she could rebuild her life properly this time, find legitimate work, and stop living in the shadow of false accusations. The plan was simple: leave before dawn while they slept. Avoid the tearful goodbyes that would only make departure harder. Clara would be upset initially, but children were resilient. She would forget Margaret eventually and accept a more suitable replacement. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Margaret checked her preparations one final time. A storm was building on the horizon, dark clouds blotting out the stars she had grown to love during her time here. The weather seemed determined to mirror her turbulent emotions. She lay down fully dressed, planning to rest briefly before beginning her journey. Sleep proved elusive as memories of the past months played through her mind, like scenes from someone else's life. Parlor and built up the fire while he introduced himself. James Morrison was a detective from Denver, tracking a case that had brought him to this remote area. The name stirred something in Margaret's memory, though she couldn't place where she had heard it before. Morrison accepted coffee gratefully and began explaining his presence in Clearwater. He had been investigating a series of thefts in Denver's wealthy district, crimes that had resulted in several innocent people being falsely accused. The real perpetrator had finally been caught attempting another robbery. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured the coffee. Morrison continued his story, describing how the true thief had confessed to planting evidence in the rooms of household staff to avoid suspicion. Several cases would now be reopened, and the wrongly accused would be cleared. The detective pulled official documents from his waterproof case. Margaret's name appeared on the list of victims whose reputations would be officially restored. The servant who had framed her had admitted to planting the jewelry out of jealousy and spite. Margaret sank into a chair as the full impact hit her. She was free. Her name was cleared. The accusations that had haunted her for months were officially proven false. She could go anywhere, do anything, rebuild her life without the shadow of supposed criminality following her. But freedom felt different than she had imagined. Instead of joy, she felt a strange emptiness as she realized what this vindication meant. She could leave the Barrett Ranch with her reputation intact, return to respectable society, perhaps even resume teaching. Morrison noticed her subdued reaction and asked about her current circumstances. Margaret explained her situation carefully, describing her work at the ranch without mentioning the emotional complexities that had developed. The detective seemed puzzled by her lack of enthusiasm about the news. Most people he had contacted were overjoyed to have their names cleared. Margaret's thoughtful silence suggested complications he didn't understand. Outside, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the parlor in stark flashes into dreams. He had been working extra hours to make up for time lost during Clara's illness, pushing himself beyond reasonable limits. These were her people now, her family in all but legal terms. The realization struck her with unexpected force as she stood in the hallway between their rooms. She belonged here not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was where her heart had chosen to stay. The storm raged on, trapping them all together while Margaret wrestled with the most important decision of her life. Freedom or love, safety or belonging. The choice would determine not just her future, but the futures of everyone sleeping peacefully around her. Thunder crashed overhead, as if the sky itself was demanding an answer to her impossible dilemma. Dawn broke with deceptive calm after the storm's fury. Margaret had spent the night wrestling with her decision. Morrison's legal papers spread across the kitchen table beside her farewell letter. The detective slept in the parlor, exhausted from his journey and the dramatic revelations of the previous evening. Clara discovered both documents when she came down for breakfast. Her scream of anguish brought both adults running. She clutched Margaret's letter to her chest while tears streamed down her face, her small body shaking with the force of her sobs. The child's grief was devastating to witness. She had already lost her mother and couldn't bear the thought of losing Margaret, too. Her pleas were heartbreaking in their desperation, as she begged Margaret not to abandon her. Eli appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled from sleep and his face creased with concern. He took in the scene quickly, his eyes moving from Clara's tears to Margaret's packed bag, to the official documents scattered across the table. Morrison introduced himself and explained the situation with professional efficiency. Margaret had been completely vindicated. The real thief was in custody and had confessed to framing multiple innocent people. She was free to resume her life anywhere she chose. The detective's words should have brought celebration, but the kitchen felt heavy with leaving because she didn't love them. She was leaving because she loved them too much to burden them with her complicated past. Her selflessness cut him deeper than abandonment would have. The conversation was interrupted by sounds of distress from outside. Through the window, they could see a horse rearing in panic near the barn, still spooked by the previous night's storm. The animal's wild movements threatened to trample anything in its path. Clara bolted from the kitchen before anyone could stop her. Her emotional state and the chaos of the morning had clouded her usual good judgment. She ran toward the barn, perhaps seeking comfort in the familiar routine of caring for the animals. Margaret reacted instantly, her maternal instincts overriding every other consideration. She burst through the door and sprinted across the muddy yard, her only thought to reach Clara before the panicked horse could cause harm. The scene unfolded with terrifying clarity. Clara stood frozen in the horse's path, her small frame dwarfed by the massive animal's thrashing hooves. Margaret threw herself forward without hesitation, scooping the child into her arms and rolling them both away from immediate danger. The horse's hoof grazed Margaret's shoulder, spinning her around but not causing serious injury. She clutched Clara protectively, shielding her with her own body until Eli could reach them and calm the frightened animal. In that moment of crisis, all pretense fell away. Margaret's actions proved what words could never express. Her love for Clara transcended employment, convenience, or social expectations. She would risk everything, including her life, to protect this child. Eli helped them both to their feet, his hands shaking as he checked for injuries. Margaret's shoulder would bruise, but nothing was broken. Clara was completely unharmed, but shaken by the close call and her own reckless behavior. The three of them stood in the muddy barnyard, breathing heavily and processing what had just occurred. Margaret had chosen instinctively to say barriers of propriety or convention. Eli spoke the words that had been building in his heart for weeks. He asked Margaret to stay not as an employee, but as his wife, Clara's mother, and the missing piece that would make their family complete. His proposal was simple, but carried the weight of absolute sincerity. Margaret looked into his eyes and saw her future reflected there. A life of love, belonging, and purpose that transcended the limitations others had tried to place on her. She had come to cook for a family, and instead had become the heart that held them together. Her acceptance sealed their fate and began the healing process that would transform all three lives forever. 6 months later, the Barrett Ranch buzzed with wedding preparations. Margaret stood before the mirror in what had once been Elena's room, now transformed into her own sanctuary. The simple white dress Clara had helped choose reflected her practical nature, while honoring the solemnity of the occasion. News of Margaret's legal vindication had spread through Clearwater faster than prairie fire. Morrison's official documents left no room for doubt about her innocence, forcing even her harshest critics to acknowledge their mistake. The transformation in public opinion was gradual, but unmistakable. The general store owner now served Margaret with grudging respect. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house had actually apologized, admitting her shame at spreading unfounded gossip. Not everyone had changed their minds, but enough had shifted to make life in town bearable. Eli's public declaration of his intentions had accelerated this acceptance. When the most successful rancher in the territory chose to marry a woman, the community reconsidered their assumptions. His reputation carried weight that gradually extended to protect Margaret as well. The wedding ceremony took place in the ranch's front parlor, decorated with wildflowers Clara had gathered from the prairie. Reverend Matthews, who had initially hesitated to perform the service, found himself moved by the obvious love between them. The vows Eli and Margaret exchanged were simple but profound. They promised to honor the love Clara had recognized before they understood it themselves. Margaret accepted not just a husband, but the role of mother she had never expected to claim. Eli welcomed not just a wife, but the healing presence that had restored warmth to his home. The reception featured food prepared by the new cook they had hired, a cheerful widow named Mrs. Patterson, who treated Clara like her own granddaughter. Margaret's transition from kitchen worker to family matriarch was complete, symbolized by her freedom from daily cooking duties. Evening brought the first quiet moment the new family had shared all day. They sat on the front porch, watching sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Clara nestled between her parents, drowsy from excitement and secure in her transformed world. Margaret reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The false accusations in Denver had seemed like the end of everything she valued. Instead, they had led her to people who loved her completely, and a purpose that fulfilled her deepest longings. 2 weeks after the wedding, Margaret opened her school in the unused barn Eli had converted for her use. 8 children attended initially, including 3 from the nearby settlement of freed slaves who had never had access to formal education. The number grew steadily as word spread about her teaching abilities. The schoolhouse became a symbol of changing attitudes in Clearwater. Children of different backgrounds learned together under Margaret's guidance, breaking down barriers their parents were only beginning to question. Education proved a powerful force for social progress. Clara thrived in this environment, her natural intelligence flowering under her mother's expert instruction. She helped translate lessons for younger children and took pride in her role as teacher's assistant. The lonely child who had orchestrated Margaret's arrival was now a confident girl, surrounded by friends. Eli found himself changed as profoundly as his wife and daughter. The cold grief that had defined him since Elena's death was replaced by them stood together at the graveside, no longer haunted by Elena's memory, but grateful for the love she had left behind. Clara's letter was buried beside the headstone, completing a circle of love that spanned life and death. Margaret's teaching expanded to include evening classes for adults who had never learned to read. The school became the heart of community improvement, proving that education could heal divisions and create opportunities for everyone willing to learn. The woman who had arrived believing she was hired to cook had instead become mother, wife, teacher, and community leader. Her journey from accused thief to respected citizen proved that love could indeed triumph over prejudice when people chose hope over fear. Clara's whispered words had changed 3 lives forever, creating the family each of them needed most.